Welcome to Unite Now, where we bring unity to you, wherever you are.
Hello, my name is Emory, and I'm here to talk to you today about mobile gaming monetization. We all know that mobile games have come a long, long way since the Apple App Store first launched in 2008, and Unity is no stranger to this part of the industry. So, first, a little bit about me. I lead the publisher operations team here in America, and I've worked in games ever since I was a kid. From starting out making Flash games way back in the pre Adobe days, when they were owned by Macromedia and ActionScript 2, to working as an artist on several indie titles. I eventually transitioned to working as a producer and product manager on some games that you might have heard of before, such as The Sims and Call of Duty. So, as you can see, I worked across a wide variety of game genres, from gritty military shooters to relaxing simulation games. I also think my phone has over 200 mobile titles on it, some of which I sunk a little bit too much time into. But that's enough reminiscing. Let's jump into the white paper. So, we have a lot of cool data to go over today. Don't worry about taking notes. The full 25-page white paper will be emailed out to all participants. Additionally, you'll be able to download the full white paper online. I'll also talk about additional resources where you can learn more. Let's talk a little bit about Unity ads. Unity is probably best known for its game engine, which powers almost 50% of mobile games on the market, as well as experiences on PC, console, and mixed reality. But Unity has also created a complete platform that enables you to not only create, but operate and monetize your games. So, in addition to our core game engine, our ad platform has massive scale. We've enabled over 285,000 apps to monetize through ad revenue, with over 100 million average daily users viewing these ads. Because of this scale and the many signals of data that we see from a variety of game genres, monetization styles, and advertisers, we've aggregated this data to provide unique insights on the mobile gaming industry that only Unity can provide. So I want to mention that we take developer privacy very seriously, and have worked to anonymize the data presented here by aggregating it all under publicly determined categories on the Google Play and Apple App Store. We've also teamed up with Delta DNA to glean insights from their annual survey about in-game advertising. This survey was also completely anonymized. And lastly, I want to talk about the team. So our team at Unity has worked at some of the most established developers and ad networks in the business. We understand gaming, ads, and most importantly, how the two of them work together. And we're here to help you make money off your app. So let's dive right into the report. First, we'll be covering how gaming revenues, particularly ad revenue, grew year over year. So mobile gaming now represents more than half of the global gaming market, and it's grown a ton. Initially, most apps monetize by being paid apps or through in-app purchases. And there was an age-old story that 3% of your users will provide all of your game's revenue through in-app purchases. However, in recent years, ad revenue has grown to dominate in some of these gaming categories. This means that developers have increasingly been able to monetize from that remaining 97% of their user base. For example, in word games, ad revenue was a majority of total revenue growth, and casual and arcade games derived nearly half of the revenue growth from ads. Now, diving into ad revenue growth per category, we see some interesting insights. First of all, ad revenue over the past year has grown across all game categories, which is great to see. But even though puzzle games grew less percentage-wise than sports games, due to the overall category growth size of puzzle games, this is actually a lot of revenue overall. Secondly, categories that have really embraced ad revenue in the past year have grown by a lot. Sports games in particular have seen a boom as more sports games casualize their gameplay with idle mechanics and reward systems. So you can see that big 87% growth is because they've adapted their gameplay genre to new ad revenue. Now that we've seen how much ad revenue has grown, how does it compare against in-app purchase revenue? Well, the results here show that word, arcade, and card games rely heavily on ads. Many of these games structure their gameplay loops around frequent ad watches. Examples include watching an ad after every few moves in a word game, or after every play session in a card game, or when you beat a level in an arcade game. In contrast, genres like strategy and role playing games are still heavily in app purchase focused. If you're familiar with mechanics in these games, this makes a lot of sense. They tend to heavily prioritize repeat spending to open mystery boxes, refresh stamina or energy, and engage with randomized gacha systems. Progression in these genres is also pretty closely tied to either time spent or money spent within the game by the player. Now let's take a look at regional breakdown. This chart shows how developers in each region make money. We can see that developers in China have really capitalized on their ad revenue. So there's definitely an opportunity for for developers in regions like Europe to optimize their ad revenue. Now, one might take a look at this data and say that users in each region have different tendencies when it comes to watching ads. But keep in mind that this data shows where the game is made and developed, not necessarily where the users are. Often, most games have global audiences. So even though a large part of your user base might be where your game is made, most games will target and release worldwide. We'll go over ad blockers in each region as well later in this webinar. All right, so now let's get into a juicier topic. There's always been myths floating around the games industry that ads negatively affect engagement metrics. They can make your game look cheap, they're intrusive, it's a bad user experience, and worst of all, they can drive users to install games that they see ads for, leaving your game and causing lower overall retention. Looking at the data, we're happy to say that that isn't the case. In fact, retention metrics were actually positive for games that had implemented ads. Now, that's not to say that just putting ads into your game will instantly improve your KPIs. They have to be put in thoughtfully. Otherwise, you could experience negative performance. And we'll go into examples of this later in our case study. But looking at the numbers here, day one retention is higher by 1.65%, which is not that much when you look at the grand scheme of things. But day seven is higher by 1.01%, which is a lot when the average day seven usually averages around 8 to 10% for most games. And then finally, D30 retention is higher by 0.54%, which is quite a bit when most games are averaging 2 to 3% in that range. If we break things down by category, we'll see that there isn't significant difference in retention metrics for most genres. Some genres like word games actually do much better with ads. This is due to what we kind of touched on earlier, which is that their core gameplay loops are built around multiple ad views, such as watching an ad after every move. Another thing to mention here is the performance of card games with and without ads. Card games without ads have higher overall retention, but this is actually because card is a very vague App Store category. Card games could be things like blackjack, poker, and solitaire apps, which are all very, very revenue driven by ads. But card games can also include things like collectible card battlers, which tend to have better retention mechanics overall, since they want players to collect cards by spending. These kind of games also tend to have less ads and more in app purchases. All right, let's take a look at games that previously didn't have ads implemented and then implemented ads. Keep in mind that this data here is limited to games on Unity's ad network. So we saw a minor decrease in day one retention, with much bigger increases in day 7 and day 30 retention. This tells us that even though players initially might churn out due to the presence of ads, they actually provide great stickiness for the remaining players to stick around. You can also mitigate this day one churn issue through proper segmentation and onboarding. For example, maybe don't show ads to players until day 2 or even week 2. That way, you let players kind of settle into your gameplay experience before you start introducing ad monetization. Next, let's look at session data. So, number of sessions actually increased from 14 to 16 after ad implementation. This could be due to proper ad implementation, encouraging players to check back in more regularly. For example, if you had a rewarded video ad that refreshed once every 4 hours and provided a cool reward, a user might remember, hey, I got this really cool reward for watching that rewarded video ad. Let me check back in after that timer has run out. That way, the user gets back into your game and is more likely to play even after watching the rewarded video ad. The increased session length here is pretty insignificant. It went from 14.3 to 15.2. And this could possibly be attributed to players spending more time in the user interface, maybe trying to find the ad and watch it or engage with other parts of the game. But what's important to note here is that session length did not decrease. So ads actually didn't have an effect on session length and might have even increased it a little bit. All right, so let's talk about the other elephant in the room, which is in-app purchases. So the percentage of payers to non-payers is known as conversion rate. Successful games boast conversion rates of 2 to 10%. These are games at the top of their charts. And to be honest, many games would be quite happy with a 3% conversion rate. When you get closer to that 10% number, you're in a really, really exclusive group. However, more than half of the games on the App Store have a 0 to 1% conversion rate. This means that average conversion rate per category is actually quite low, as you can see on this chart over here. There are certain outliers like role playing games and strategy games that stand out as categories that are home to more mid core games that encourage both in app purchase spending and engagement. However, even these categories have low overall averages, with role playing games at 1.52% and strategy games at 1.14%. So, the low average conversion rate that we see across most games means that ads are a really important revenue stream for many games that have not yet made it to the top charts or are still trying to find their footing in terms of how to best convert their players. Ads can help tide over your development team until they're able to enact features that can convert more players, and they continue to provide an important revenue stream even after you set those conversion rates up. So next, let's look at a couple more in-app purchasing metrics, particularly average number of transactions per player and average amount per transaction. You'll notice that for people who do convert, they're only buying 1 to 2 things. The average purchase amount per transaction ranges from around $5 to $10. So if you do the math, all in all, revenue from a converted player might only be $7 to around $20. These players can cost quite a bit of money and time to acquire and convert. So getting that amount of revenue back might not cover your user acquisition costs or feature development costs developing engagement features to get them in there. Factoring all this in, ad revenue continues to be an important factor to make players contribute more revenue over a lifetime within your game, whether that's a short amount of time or hopefully a long amount of time. So let's see what happened in games that had in app purchases that weren't running ads before, but then implemented them. So if we look at these charts over here, we can see that conversion rate has actually grown by 1.1%. That's a lot. That's actually nearly double to go from 1.5% to 2.6%. So if you remember those conversion rate numbers we talked about earlier, this is a really big increase. And speaking of things that nearly doubled, average number of in-app purchases per user also doubled after ad implementation. This could be due to rewarded ads giving players that kind of taste of premium items or currency, which has been shown to increase conversion rates and number of purchases. Lastly, average in-app purchase revenue per user rose by 15 cents per user, while average revenue per payer fell by 38 cents. But due to the increased number of conversions and number of purchases per user increasing, the game overall generated more revenue after ads were implemented. All right, finally, we'll go over some ad performance numbers for 2019. On average, over a quarter of mobile game players watch at least one ad per day. This means that users are getting more accustomed to interacting with ads in mobile games. Of users who do watch ads, they pretty much watch 3 to 4 ads per category, regardless of what kind of games they're playing. So there's a myth that players in certain more hardcore or midcore genres don't like ads. But if we look at the data, players who play strategy and role-playing games, both fairly hardcore genres, watch basically just as many ads as casual genres like word and casino games. So we can actually see from here that ad watching habits are kind of agnostic across category, which means there's definitely opportunity for a lot of categories to implement ads when they otherwise would have been more scared about scaring away their hardcore players. All right, next, let's break down how eCPM performs by continent. As a reminder, eCPM is revenue per 1,000 impressions. It actually stands for effective cost per mil being the Latin for 1,000. eCPM depends on how much advertisers are willing to pay for a desired action, such as an app install or a click. We can see here the most valuable users are in Asia and North America, but not trailing that far behind are Europe and Oceania, which includes New Zealand and Australia. And then after that, you've got Africa, South America, and Antarctica. We've seen Africa and South America emerge as great emerging markets that have good volume of ads, but their eCPMs are still kind of low. And it's sad to say, but Antarctica probably isn't the best place for you to be acquiring users. Now, on the chart to the right, we've broken down the average number of ads watched per watcher in each region. You'll notice that they all range from 3 to 4, but Korea actually ends up on the higher side at 4.54 ads watched per watcher. So there could be an opportunity here to show an additional ad to Korean users. Obviously, you don't want to just fatigue your user with a ton of ads, but if you can do proper geo-segmentation, you can test whether or not it's worth doing this kind of increased overall ad limit for users in specific regions. So we've talked a lot about metrics and data around ad implementation. Let's dive into a case study where we help the developer effectively integrate ads into their game. We've anonymized this game in question for the developer's privacy. So to set a little bit of context, a casual game wanted to increase their daily active user count, and they already had ads implemented. They had tried acquiring users before, but that didn't get much traction. Their user acquisition costs outweighed the revenue that they were getting back from each one of their users over the course of that user's lifetime. Their day 1 and day 7 retention numbers were actually quite good, but there were certainly some optimizations that could be done. So we worked with them on a bunch of improvements, but we want to highlight 3 of them. And you can see the game stats before we started working with them here. So the game had a mechanic where if you watched a video ad, you could spin a reward wheel that gave you some pretty good prizes like premium currency and upgrades. Users could watch as many ads as they wanted to spin this wheel as many times as they wanted. This led to 2 bad things. The first was eCPM decay, which meant that each subsequent ad watch got them less money. Users got a ton of premium currency and upgrades, which let them advance quickly and easily. This meant that a few users actually ended up purchasing anything. We helped the developer translate their ad eCPM into their in-game rewards. So basically, we mapped the maximum rewards based on the CPM to avoid IAP cannibalization and crazy fast game progression. We then recommended frequency capping via cooldowns, for example, spinning once every 4 hours instead of spinning constantly, and we rebalanced the rewards around this cooldown. So we want to make sure that the rewards from this game, from the ad watching, didn't crazily impact the game economy and progression. So the game had another rewarded video ad where if you watched an ad, you got a new character. And of all the characters available in the shop, the ad always rewarded the most valuable character that had been unlocked. Um, this meant that users felt great about watching ads because they always got the most expensive character in the shop. So initially this was fine, but as the player progressed and the characters became more valuable, the eCPM that they got from each ad remained the same. This meant that the developer ended up giving away more and more value as the player progressed per ad watch, which is obviously not a great idea if you want to retain users long term and get them to purchase in the long term. So we worked with the developer to highlight this issue. We mapped out the character value to the ad eCPM dollar value. We implemented new reward configurations to scale as the user progressed, and we stopped giving away the most expensive content for the same exact ad impression. In the end, we found that users still retained and engaged really well, but they weren't progressing through the game super quickly at a pace that the developer wasn't able to create new content for. And after we had solved some of the issues with existing ad placements, the developer wanted to find places to put more ads. We were seeing great performance across the other things that we had fixed, and they really wanted to scale up the number of ad impressions per user. So we recommended interstitial, skippable ads at breakpoints in the core loop, as well as additional opt-in video ads. We also recommended more of these opt-in video ads when the player felt like they had accomplished something so that the ads felt good to interact with. So, for example, there was a puzzle where the player had to find a certain item, and upon getting that item, they would get a prize. We implemented a new rewarded video at that point where the user could either decide to claim their original prize amount for finding that item in the puzzle, or they could choose to watch a rewarded video ad and get even more of a prize for finding that individual item. This made it so that the user felt like the ad itself was almost free reward because when they found something and did well in the puzzle, they were able to get a larger prize for it. We saw really great engagement around this ad servicing point. So the ends of results here were clear. The game was able to scale up successfully, and we were very happy to see our developers succeed. After all, Unity believes that the world is better with more creators, and one way to get more creators out there is to make sure that they can make sustainable revenue from their creations. So if you take a look at the DAU, they started out around 4,000, but it ended up at 145,000. This is obviously due to the fact that they were able to scale their user acquisition successfully, but let's highlight some of the other metrics that they were able to do with. So their conversion went from 0.2% to 0.25%. This isn't a huge increase, but a lot of the revenue from this game is from ads. Their day one retention went up from 46.5%, which is already pretty healthy, to 55.5%, which is amazing. That means over half of their first day users continue to play the game. Their day 7 retention went from 10.2% to 16.7%. These are also really strong numbers. That's an increase of almost 50% from before. And finally, day 30 retention went from 2.3% to 5.4%. This is over double the day 30 retention, which meant that the new suggestions and mechanics we work with them, both around our engagement mechanics and our ad revenue mechanics, made it so that users actually would retain for longer periods of time, all the way until day 30, which is kind of the gold standard in terms of long-term users. And finally, the daily in-app purchase revenue went from $45 to $1,000, which was actually a massive percentage-wise increase. And their daily ad revenue went from $240 to $3,200. So daily IAP revenue increase here is large because we actually managed to make it so that users slowed down enough that they were actually pausing to interact with the shop in the game and purchase things to help them progress instead of continually watching ads over and over again to progress at a fast pace. And daily ad revenue here didn't suffer either. It still rose accordingly with their DAU counts. To close out this webinar, we want to throw out some predictions for 2020. These are not meant to be surefire calls, but are based on quantitative and qualitative data. The first prediction we had was that hyper-casual growth would start to slow down. So, hyper-casual games took the mobile industry by storm a few years ago, but we've seen successive titles cannibalize the market from each other. A lot of developers in this space have also started branching out into casual or mid-core games that have longer retention cycles and more involved gameplay. The second prediction is that more games that currently don't have ads will start adopting ad revenue. In particular, these games will likely only do rewarded video ads, as adding a forced interstitial ad could negatively affect engagement metrics. A lot of these games are older games that have more elderly player bases who are pretty likely to view forced interstitial ads as something that's bad. But if you implement rewarded video ads, these players might see that as an additional value add bonus. So now they're able to engage with your game more and might even revitalize some of these players who might have lapsed. Lastly, we think that more non-gaming apps will adopt rewarded video ads. Currently, many non-gaming apps like educational apps, fitness trackers, weather apps, and music apps will use banner ads or force interstitials to derive ad revenue from their users. These apps usually have premium versions or features behind a subscription or paywall. However, we've noticed that these apps are starting to gamify their systems and include things like progression, cosmetics, and currency, both soft and premium. This opens up opportunity for rewarded video ads in these kind of non-gaming apps. All right, so that brings me to the end of this webinar. If you want to learn more, the Unity Learn platform hosts over 750 hours of learning content made by Unity and our partners, including 50 courses, 1,400 tutorials, and bi-weekly live sessions. Over 2 million people have access to Unity Learn platform since launching last year, and it's an excellent resource to continue building your Unity skills, both in creating games and monetizing them. So that brings me to the end of this webinar. I want to thank you for your time and hope you guys learned something. Great. Thank you so much.